Welcome to Robin's Nest Studios. In today's video, we're going to be filling them gaps. I have recently decided to venture away from green stuff for gap filling. This is primarily because of how sticky green stuff is and how annoying it can be to work with at times. If you've ever worked with green stuff before, you know what I'm talking about. It's sticky to the touch. You kind of need like a Vaseline, or you have to get it wet so that you can mold around with it without it sticking to your fingers as you're trying to fill in gaps or sculpt. I wanted a product where I didn't have to worry about that. And the product I decided to try out was Apoxie sculpt. Now, this is not a sponsored video. This is just me venturing away from green stuff and wanting to try a new product. I was looking at a couple two-part epoxies to switch over to. One of the main reasons I chose Apoxie sculpt is because of the containers it comes in. I'm a sucker for a plastic container with a lid. Don't have to worry about keeping it in a cardboard box or having it just laying around, kind of like how I used to keep the green stuff in just those plastic sheets. Both parts come in a separate plastic tub that you can scoop out and mix whenever you're ready. So I decided to share my Apoxie sculpt experiment with you by gap filling a swamp horror. Before we can start filling these gaps, we got to get the epoxy mixed up. First we get a little scoop of B, then we come in here and we get a little scoop of A. Then from there we proceed to knead the two halves together. A lot of the gaps on this model are seams, so I'm rolling up a little piece of putty here so that I can easily place it into that seam, and from there I can manipulate the putty with the sculpting tool. Here I've got some putty in the gap, and I took a little bit of water and I'm using that to smooth the putty out through the details so we don't wash everything out. Here I took another strip of that putty and I'm using the sculpting tool to push it into that gap. This is a sufficient gap, so I have to make sure I fill it but also keep the surface area flush. One thing I can definitely say about this epoxy sculpt as opposed to something like green stuff is that it's actually much easier to manipulate. I'm able to move it without actually fighting against the material itself. Here I'm pushing around the putty, trying to get a nice contour that flows nicely with the already existing shapes of this model. Back to this guy's left tentacle, I am doing that water trick again, thinning out the putty so as I don't wash out all the detail. Here I'm using my tool to sculpt in some of that detail that was unavoidably distorted when we were filling in this gap. Next up, we're going to fill the gaps around the mandible on the face of this guy. We use the same trick where we roll up a little bit of putty and then we push it into place with the sculpting tool. The epoxy sculpt was so easy to work with that I found myself kind of zoning out while I was working on some of these finer details. And I believe that's due to how soft it is, as opposed to something like green stuff that tends to be on the stiffer and stickier side while you're working with it. While I was filling the gaps around the jawline, I kind of distorted some of the detail on the carapace of this octopus. So I came in here with some Apoxie sculpt and I did my best to kind of sculpt them back in. Then we'll repeat that process on the other side to maintain symmetry. The key to doing something like this is to just keep playing around with it until it looks right to you. Try not to put too much thought into it, just go with it. While I was filling in the back here, I used a little bit too much putty, so we used the opposite end of the tool to scrape away any excess. Now, when I was building this model and clipping everything off, there was apparently a tooth that was attached to a rear tentacle in the molding process. I thought it was flash, so I threw it out. So I was left with no other choice but to sculpt in a new tooth myself. I had no clue what this tooth was supposed to look like, so I just kinda messed around with it until I got a shape that I was happy with. Here you can see a couple photos of the epoxy sculpt after it had finished curing. And then here we have the model primed in black and ready for a paint job. After being able to use the epoxy sculpt with a gap filling project, I think I can comfortably say I'm happy with the switch. In my opinion, the way the epoxy sculpt behaved while gap filling was way more fluid than green stuff. The biggest plus that I noticed was I wasn't fighting the material while I was trying to sculpt in some of that detail that I washed out. And similar to green stuff, I was able to take a little bit of water and put it on the epoxy sculpt to smooth out certain areas. All in all, I think I'm definitely going to be using the epoxy sculpt for future projects. That being said, green stuff still does have its uses for those projects that may require something that's a little bit more tacky. But let me know in the comments section down below, what's your favorite product for gap filling? Have you used epoxy sculpt? What are your feelings on it? Like, share, subscribe, all that other social media stuff. I've got to fly. And as always, keep on painting, peeps.